Welcome to the session on comparing the automated insulin delivery systems available in the UK. I've got a special thanks to Anne-Marie for helping me put these slides together. It's been used in a previous presentation, but it's just a nice overview of the different systems and what essentially there are differences between them. So very briefly, as we've discussed before, automated insulin delivery systems essentially have three components. You have an insulin pump that is delivering insulin continuously. You have a continuous glucose monitor that is measuring the glucose continuously. And then you have an algorithm that is either placed within the pump or on a phone or within a pod that is actually doing the calculations based off the insulin information, based off the glucose information to increase or decrease the insulin to ideally keep the glucose level in target as often as possible and ideally aiming for a specific target level. These are the four systems that are commercially available in the UK as of March 2024. You've got the Medtronic 780G, you've got the CamAPS FX with either the Ypsomed pump or the Dana pump, you've got the Control IQ, which now is available with the G6 and the G7, and you've got the Omnipod 5 as well. So you've got the various different options across the way here. These will obviously change in terms of what they're compatible with in terms of sensors and potentially pumps as they go along. But this overview should really serve as how the algorithm works, and then the hardware will obviously be a little bit interchangeable depending on what happens in terms of approvals, etc. So there are three different types of algorithms. There's model predictive algorithms where essentially they predict future glucose to bring it back to the target, and they often include variables such as glucose, where the glucose is going, insulin on board, sometimes carbohydrates on board, for example, and that's where the majority of the systems are. So the Control IQ, CAMS, APS FX and Omnipod 5 sit within that bucket. There's proportional integral derivatives, where essentially there's analysis of the deviation of the measured glucose from the target glucose to calculate an amount of insulin to deliver. So it looks at less variables, and it's just essentially looking at trying to drive you to a target level, and that's the 780G. And there's a third one called fuzzy logic, which essentially none of the current available systems have, and to be honest, I've got no idea how it works. So we'll start with the 780G. One thing that's important to know is you don't need manually set, it doesn't work off manually set basal rates, so changing the basal rates will not impact auto mode. It essentially works out the basal rates based off the total daily dose and the starting insulin doses over the first few days. When the glucose level is dropping, it will reduce the basal insulin to prevent hypoglycemia and keep it at the target level. When the glucose level is rising, it will increase the basal level to prevent the sensor from going above the target level. And importantly, it is quite aggressive in that when the sensor glucose is predicted to go over 6.7 and the max basal is reached, it will deliver auto corrections to be more aggressive on managing those. It has an adjustable glucose target and an adjustable active insulin that can really drive the algorithm. And essentially the algorithm uses real-time information to adjust the basal delivery every 5 minutes, essentially aiming to get the sensor glucose level to the target glucose level as quickly as possible. It uses the total daily dose and updates the sensitivity factor every midnight and updates the maximum minimum auto basal every 6 to 12 days. So you can see that obviously the current day's insulin will affect the insulin sensitivity for the next day, and you will also see that the updates to how aggressive the auto basal will be every 6 to 12 days. Here's just a bit showing in action. So you can see the sensor glucose here is drifting down. You can see the auto basal delivery is slowed and then stops to prevent hypoglycemia. As the glucose level starts to rise to target, it increases it again. And then when there is food or potentially maybe hypotreatment or with the glucose is rising, it's giving max basal, and once that max basal is reached, auto corrections are delivered to bring it back down. So you can see it's constantly upping and down the basal and throwing in auto corrections as required to keep it at the target level. Default setting is at 5.5 millimoles per litre, the tightest, but it can be increased to 6.1 or 6.7. And again, auto corrections is set above 6.7 when that max basal has been reached. So you can see there, that's simplistically how the 780G algorithm works. In contrast, the Control IQ algorithm, most importantly, it works from the programmed basal rates. So it doesn't use a total daily dose or previous day's insulin delivery to work out its basal rate. It uses what the has been set in the pump by either the person with diabetes or the healthcare team, or in collaboration. So obviously it's important to make sure that the programmed basal rates are something close to what that person needs as the basal delivery. Control IQ will need the person's weight, will need sensitivity factors and also carb ratios, and also use the current glucose level and trend arrow and insulin on board. It uses all the information to depend on the 10-minute predicted blood glucose, and essentially it will aim to change the insulin every 5 minutes, trying to keep the glucose level between 6.3 and 8.9, and the glucose target is set at 6.1, and the active insulin time cannot be adjusted and is set out at 5 hours. Pretty simply, you get the idea here. It's looking to maintain the glucose level between 6.3 and 8.9. If it's predicted to be below there, it slows down the basal insulin. If it's predicted to be below 3.9, it actually stops the insulin. Similarly, if the glucose level is predicted to be above 8.9, it increases the basal delivery. And if it's predicted to be above 10.0, it will give an autocorrection of 60% of the amount of insulin needed per hour to try and prevent it from going above 10. So again, you can see the slight differences from the algorithms. The main one from the 780G being is that it works off the programmed sensitivity factors and basal rates to really determine how aggressive the algorithm will be. So it's very user dependent, which has its pros because it means you can be very sensitive to someone's changing insulin needs across the day. But also on the downside of that is it means you need to keep those basal rates and sensitivity factors close to what that person needs on a regular basis, especially for children and people, as their insulin requirements change, obviously every 3 months or so. The CamAPS FX has more variables that it considers, so it predicts what the glucose will be over the next 2.5 to 4 hours, and it has predictions based on the glucose data, active insulin time, sensitivity factors, carbohydrate intakes, and what it does is it models several future scenarios, and it selects a scenario which will most likely lead to the desired glucose trajectory, and then it uses that to calculate the insulin dose via extended boluses every 10 to 12 minutes that it adjusts. Very key, it has an adjustable personal glucose target at several different times of the day, which means as low as 4.4 or as high as 11, which means it does have a lot of ability to be able to adjust that to the individual's preferences. It uses body weight, total daily dose from the last 5 days, and the learned insulin needs from previous days, and obviously current glucose levels and trend arrows. The Omnipod 5 is called the Smart Adjust algorithm, where it predicts where the glucose will be in 60 minutes time and adjusts the insulin every 5 minutes. It delivers basal, and also as basal is delivered as microboluses every 5 minutes, and the customizable target is as low as 6.1 and as high as 8.3. And also as a smart bolus calculator that takes into account where the glucose is going in terms of trend arrows and adjusts the amount of insulin according to that. The carb ratios and correction factors can be used within the bolus calculator at meal times, but the Smart Adjust creates its own sensitivity for the algorithm. It does not use the sensitivities that are programmed into the bolus calculator. So it is important to keep the sensitivity factors up to date in case users manually correct, but it won't affect the algorithm in terms of how aggressive that will be. When the new pod's activated, the system adapts to the insulin based on what's called the adaptive basal rate and takes into account previous pod's insulin. And when out of loop mode, it will deliver whatever the programmed basal rate is. So it's important again that the basal rates are kept up to date. So there's this overview, and in the next sections we'll be going through in more detail each of the systems specifically and talking about pictures and looking at downloads and how it works. So I've gone through that fairly quickly just to give you an overview of the differences, and we'll cover a little bit more of that now. But rest assured, when it comes to the individual systems, we'll be going through it in more detail. We'll be showing what it looks like on downloads. We'll be talking about optimal settings in terms of active insulin times and targets when we get to the specific systems. This is just a broad overview to give you a sort of a primer for what is about to come. You may want to have a look at certain things, certainly from what their things are compatible with. So for example, you can see the names, which pumps they use, you can see which sensors they're compatible with, you can see what their licensing current requirements are, as of March 2024, that is. So again, you may have age restrictions, for example. You can see that the parameters that they use to determine the algorithm, and again, we've talked a lot about the basal and auto-correction adjustments. So this table here should just serve as a reference guide, but in reality, when you get in clinical practice, you're not going to be using this information. You're going to want to know what are the things that we can change in terms of target levels that will adjust the algorithm, and what they are. What adjustable parameters will actually impact how the algorithm works. Therefore, can we make the algorithm stronger or weaker at certain times of the day? Those things are important to know. How can you override the algorithm with temporary target levels, ease-offs or boosts? And then obviously, when does it revert back to manual mode, and what do we need to keep up to date? I'm specifically not going into the details here because on each of the 4 systems, we will go into depth on each one of these systems, how it works, what to adjust, and how you can think about how to adjust it. This just serves as a comparison table for you if you want to know how they differ across the different settings. Some of the quirks which we'll talk about onboarding, certainly from a Medtronic 780G perspective, you have to have the pump in open loop mode for at least 48 hours for it to learn how much insulin is being used before the algorithm will start. Some of the key things which we will discuss: if you want as much time in range as possible, get the active insulin time down at 2.5 hours and the target at 5.5. For example, some of the things on the tandem control IQ, you may want stronger carb ratios than you had previously had. And again, there's different quirks for different systems. And again, exercise we'll discuss in greater detail. And this now has been changed for the tandem. So with the latest version on 7.7, previously on the older version of the software, you would have to set the activity mode before you started, then stop it afterwards, which became a problem because people forgot to stop it afterwards. Now, you can actually see that you will be able to time it by setting it for how long you want to do. So again, we'll discuss all of those within the exercise section. And then again, when we start talking about if you require extra insulin for high fat and high protein meals, we will cover that off at the end. So again, these just serve as an opportunity to compare the systems simply, but really what we want is system specifics and a system specific session. Hence, that's what the next 4 sessions will be. Regardless of whatever system you use, key things: need to pre-bolus ideally 10 to 15 minutes before. You still need to plan for exercise and announce exercise. Apart from the Omnipod, you need to suspend and remove the pump when you're doing things like showers to make sure that the algorithm doesn't think that it's giving you insulin when it doesn't. Sensors, getting sensors as accurate as possible is absolutely key, and we covered that in the last session. Keeping healthy sites, which again we discuss, and then obviously notice when you're being kicked out of closed loop mode into open loop mode, and make sure you get back in there as quickly as possible. And here's the reality: they're all amazing systems. They all will deliver the type of outcomes that the children, people and people who we support require, which is 60% to 70% time in range, improved quality of life. Everyone will have their own preferences, therefore really as healthcare providers we should be offering them all the systems, and then the ones that they choose we should be able to support them so that they get the full benefit of whichever system suits them best. Here's just some things that we consider. First of all, when we offer choice, we talk about the age ranges to make sure we're working within indications for use. A really big thing is a mobile phone required? Yes, you do need one for the CAMS and the Omnipod 5, and no, you don't for the Tandem and the MiniMed 780G, so a phone could be a big consideration. There may be a preference for CGM, and now CGM is obviously the Dexcom G7s available with the Control IQ, so depending on which sensor someone's used might determine which system they potentially want to use. Control over the algorithm is a big consideration from a healthcare professional perspective when discussing this with your patients. If you've got someone like a young person who's got very, very sensitive to insulin overnight and a lot more during the day, something like a Control IQ offers you ultimate flexibility. However, on the flip side, it means you've got to keep those settings up to date. And then again, if you want moderate control, you've got the Omnipod 5 and CAMS. And if you want little control and just let the system do its thing and minimal settings to update, then the 780G is great. Tubing, obviously, you've only got the Omnipod 5 without a tubing. And then again, We've developed our own little Google form to allow people to select themselves with objective information. So it's up to you to decide how you feel best to do that. But it's important, again, to think about the type of considerations you want. And we believe, like I said, first of all, age range, mobile phone, CGM preference, control of the algorithm, tubing or not, and obviously allowing them to make choices themselves. And again, these are our pre-work requirements to make sure that they understand what insulin pump therapy and AID therapy entails, so that they can then, of course, be ready to start the system and be well educated. Hope that's helped, and yeah, we'll now get stuck into the most important part, which is the individual systems, how they work, how to set them up, what to consider for change, and then most importantly, when you've got a download, how are you going to support getting the 70% timing range outcomes that we're looking for.